In the meantime, I just welcome you all to the Academy stage in this beautiful day of Dutch summer. Very warm, very bright, as usual here. And we have a very, very interesting, even fascinating, I would say, panel today, because actually this topic of financial fair play, as it's massively known, is as complex as fascinating. And for that, we have two wonderful guests, two wonderful speakers. Kieran Maguire, he's a football finance lecturer at the Liverpool University, also a journalist, author. He wrote the book, The Price of Football. So welcome, Kieran.
Thank you.
He also had a podcast with the same name, The Price of Football, just so you know. And of course, Charlie Methven, co-owner of Charlton Athletics. So welcome, Charlie.
Thank you very much.
Let's start with this topic, which can be very, very intricate, just like setting the context with you, Kieran. Why were the financial fair play, or now known as financial sustainability rules, introduced? Why did they have the need to do it?
Well, I think if we have to be honest, we've had some disruptors to football with the rise of trophy asset owners, with the introduction of sovereign wealth funds into the industry. And there was concern from the existing successful clubs that people were able to buy success. And therefore, having some form of cost control or financial controls introduced into the industry would prevent disruptors coming in. We've seen this with PSG, with Chelsea, with Manchester City, and so on. Would make it more difficult for new entrants to the market to start to, as I think some clubs felt, steal the places in the Champions League to which they're entitled to, steal the trophies they were familiar with, and so on. So we have had a variety of rules introduced. Initially, it was the aim of paying down debt, but when you've got especially clubs coming who are owned by Middle East countries, the concept of debt and interest is inconsistent with Islamic finance, so therefore that wasn't really successful. So we now have financial sustainability rules, which, in my view, as an accountant, as somebody that used to teach creative accounting on Wall Street, that to me doesn't work, because the rules allow clubs to lose money and the rules allow clubs to spend money on things which are excluded from the calculations.
So Charlie, what's the perspective from a smaller club point of view?
Well, I think, as Kieran said, the sort of the propulsion towards financial sustainability rules of one kind or another, and we'll come on to all the various different kinds of rules which there are, came from effectively two directions. On the one hand, as Kieran said, from the biggest clubs wanting to protect their position, and on the other hand, from the fact that a lot of smaller to medium-sized clubs were simply going out of business. And whilst in a normal capitalist environment, businesses going out of business is just part of what makes the whole system work. The weak go to the wall, the strong get stronger, new entrants come in. In football, that doesn't really work, because these aren't just businesses, they're social institutions, and they're entities which people, families, whole communities have their identity bound up in. So the view has been taken, which I entirely share, that it's not good enough just to say, well, you know, if a club's not very well run, it just goes out of existence. Then, as you know, as our then Prime Minister said, you get whole towns in floods of tears, and that's not a good place to be. So I'm wholeheartedly behind rules, regulation, carefully thought through ways of ensuring that the industry has some degree of sanity within it. It doesn't have to be totally sane. It is a sport, and it is, you know, not for the faint-hearted in business terms. People shouldn't go into it expecting a steady dividend, and there's no reason particularly for football clubs to turn a profit. There's no great reason for that. On the other hand, a structure which allows well-run clubs to progress and do well without being gazumped by sudden splurges of cash from either short-term or long-term owners who decide that's what they want to do, I think that's healthy for the industry as a whole.
Kieran, let's just dig into how it works, especially in the two biggest leagues in the world, Premier League and La Liga, because our prep conversation was really interesting about that, and you were telling the differences in all, especially La Liga has a very special gimmick. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, as far as La Liga is concerned, I think it's a fascinating model that they have. What clubs have to do is to identify their financial obligations over the next 12 months. They then compare that to their expected income stream, and those figures are audited by the La Liga financial regulators. And whatever's left over is what you can spend on wages. So if you have existing installments with regards to transfer fees, and these can be very significant. If we take a look at the Premier League, for example, the 20 Premier League clubs, between them, owe €3.5 billion in outstanding transfer fees. And that's a huge sum of money. Well, if that was operating under La Liga's rules, we'd say how much of that's got to be paid across in the next 12 months. What are your existing sort of financial commitments in terms of the overheads of the club, the non-player wages, the rent that you're paying, the insurance costs, the travel costs, in terms of the operational activities of the football club? Well, you compare those two figures to your expected level of income, and the balancing figure is your wage. So therefore, if you want to sign a player for X million euros, you submit the details of the deal to La Liga on an app, and the app comes back, and you'll get either a red light or a green light, and that will dictate to you. If you get a red light, what you've got to do, you've either got to sell a player, or in the case of some of the clubs, you will sell some of your future income in order to accelerate income. And I don't necessarily think from a business point of view that's a good idea, but if you're desperate to sign player X or player Y, and you've got a chief executive or a president who has been elected on the basis of spending money, then sometimes sort of what I would view as common sense goes out of the window, because we have the rule of short term. So that's how it works in La Liga. As far as the Premier League is concerned, it's broadly similar to the rules which we've historically had at UEFA. You have an agreed limit of losses, and from my point of view as an accountant, losses, if a client comes to me and says, what's my profit or loss going to be? I look around the room, check that there's no bugs in the room, pull down the curtains and say, what do you want it to be? Because are you trying to sell the business? Are you trying to reduce your tax? The problem with profit, it's a very, very abstract theory, and it's open to interpretation and judgment, and some would say manipulation.
What's the role, Charlie, of UEFA in all this?
Well, I think for exactly the reason that Kieran's just said, the hilariously named profit and sustainability rules, hilarious because it engenders neither profitability nor sustainability, are effectively being thrown out the window by UEFA. So UEFA are bringing in a 70% SCCR squad cost squad cost control ratio.
That's right.
Correct? Yep. Right, which effectively is a mechanism which is rather oddly borrowed from England's lower leagues. England's lower leagues have something called the Salary Cap Management Protocol, SCMP, and basically what it says is you're only allowed to spend a certain percentage of your overall revenues on your first team, right? So let's say, for instance, you have a club with revenues of £10 million, then in League One, which is the third division of English football, the SCMP is set at 60%. So you're then allowed to spend £6 million in theory. I'm slightly sort of making the whole thing simplified a little bit, but you're allowed to spend £6 million on your first team wages, and then you have £4 million to run the rest of your club. If you decide that you want to spend more on your academy, it's fine. If you decide that you want to spend more on improving your stadium, it's fine, but that's the maximum amount you're allowed to spend on your wages. Now, effectively, UEFA, by bringing in a 70% SCMP or SCCR, whatever you want to call it, are applying the same structure to the whole thing. So effectively, if you look at English football, you've got UEFA saying to clubs who want to qualify for European football, which would probably be, I'm guessing, about 12 of the Premier League clubs would think of themselves as being potential European clubs, that you guys are going to have to subscribe to 70% SCCRs, And in the third and fourth division, it's 60% and 50%, so you're also in this system. So really then what we're left with is a small rump of English clubs, the lower half of the Premier League and the Championship, the second division, probably the least sustainable league in the entire of professional football, operating on effectively an old model. So what the Premier League are now saying is to the clubs in the bottom half of the Premier League, well, you're going to have to come to 85%. You're going to have to at least come in the same structure. And if you did qualify for European football, your revenues would go up quite a lot. So actually, you'd still be able to fit within the 70% as well. There's then separately a negotiation happening on and off between the Premier League and the lower divisions. And one of the conditions of the Premier League in the financial settlement that they've been discussing with the Football League is that the Championship, the second division, would also have to come under effectively the SCCR regime. So then you'll have all of English football effectively on a UEFA regime kind of thing, more or less. There are some small differences in how it gets applied. And of course, there are differences in the kind of penalties that are potentially being applied. But that's the regime that we're going to in England in a sort of inexorable way, because it's being fed down from the top and also from the bottom. So gradually, clubs are going to be squeezed into that reality. What that then means in terms of the Championship clubs is interesting, because effectively you've got the second division clubs in England who are trying to compete to get into the Premier League. The sort of total financial reward for getting into the Premier League, I estimate, as being around about £250 million, so 300 million euros. So you've got clubs in the Championship saying, "But I want to lose a lot of money because I want to get there. And you're now stopping me from competing against the clubs who have just come down from the Premier League, who have something that we call parachute payments." And parachute payments are the adjustment mechanism which Premier League clubs get when they get relegated from the Premier League to help them sort out their wage bills effectively over a 2 or 3 year period, but it gives them a big financial advantage during those 2 or 3 years. So there are various tensions within English football which are gradually being worked out, very gradually, and with much arm wrestling and fighting. And in a way, what UEFA have done has helped the situation, in my view, in English football, in saying, look, this P&S thing is rubbish. You know, you're going to have to go on to a percentage-based ratio. That starts to make us more unified and starts to give us a sort of structure that we can all sort of understand and live in.
Kieran, how long do you think it will take until we have something that is more or less, I'm not going to say perfect, but ideal? Because this is something, kind of new in football. So it's been developing moment by moment. And where are we now?
I think we're in a system which will effectively reinforce the status quo. If you're going to move under the new UEFA rules, we are currently moving from 90% to 80% to 70% of your spending. And that spending is on player wages, amortization of transfer fees, agents' fees, and impairment of players. Now, as an accountant, I can manipulate some of those numbers, by the way. What happens if Kylian Mbappe decides to become the groundsman at Real Madrid next season? That's not player wages. So can you see what happens for players who have got parallel contracts as ambassadors for particular brands or particular countries, and their wages are therefore not going through the football club? There are many, many ways. And as soon as the new sets of rules come out, I won't tell you who's in these WhatsApp groups, but there are WhatsApp groups of accountants and lawyers who get together and say, well, if we do this and we do that and we do that, we can get around the rules. So it just becomes a game of whack-a-mole, I think, as far as the authority. So we'll never be in a perfect position. And also, I think you've got to define what your objectives are in terms of progress. If you want the same clubs who are winning the same competitions as they have done for the last 5, 10, 20 years to continue to win those competitions and for there to be no other clubs to challenge them, then the rules are working as they are set to be. If you want to have more disruptors, then the rules are not ideal. So until we set our objectives in football, I can't determine whether or not the rules will be successful. And also, from my point of view, the rules that are being introduced will still allow clubs to lose huge amounts of money. Is that good for football? I think football will survive. If we take a look at other sports, we see clubs in other sports becoming physically bankrupt and ceasing to exist. In football, because it's a global sport, we have the benefit of what we refer to as the find a bigger fool theory. Every time you think a club is about to go out of business, there's another idiot, there's another fool who will come along and they will buy that football club because they are convinced that they have the skills and they have the knowledge from their industry to rescue that club. And then 18 months later, the club's still losing money because you get football is your mistress. Football seduces you into spending more money. The Premier League is spectacularly successful in the sense that if I take a look at what's happened over the Premier League's existence, consumer prices in the UK have gone up by 106% in 30 years since the Premier League started. Okay, 106%. Premier League revenue has gone up by 2,800%. Absolutely fantastic. You think about a mature industry, an industry which has already been in existence for generations and generations, 28 times more successful at generating revenue. And isn't that absolutely fantastic? Until you look at costs and you find out that costs have gone up by 3,800% in the form of wages. So we have this saying in business, revenue is vanity, and that's what people get seduced by. Profit is sanity. The reason why football does not have a money problem in terms of revenue, football has a cost control problem. Whether that's being addressed or not, we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when we talk about disruptors, and of course, generally speaking, in most industries, so what one wants disruptors. The problem is, what's the collateral damage of allowing free rein to disruptors? Because let's be honest, when we say disruptors, we're not talking mostly about people who try and do things cleverly. We're talking about people who just come and blow their brains out, spending a lot of cash on strikers. There are clubs who have come in and who have done things cleverly, and who have spent money in interesting ways, and who have achieved outsized success. I was watching Atalanta the other day thinking, well, I'm going to go back and see how much Atalanta has spent compared to other clubs. Not all that much. If we look in our country, and you look at the net cost that has been spent on Brentford and Brighton to get where they are, basically in the top half of the Premier League as small to medium-sized clubs, but they're there on they have been disruptive in the use of data, in the way in which they scout players overseas. That's disruption, and they've done it, and they've got into Europe, in Brighton's case. So I don't think that there is... The ceiling is that basically it's unrealistic to think that any club other than a very big club is going to become a very big club. But can you get almost there? Yes. And is that fair, is that a good enough prize? Is that a good enough prize? Is it okay, the fact that Atalanta can win the second major European trophy, does that not prove against Bayer, right? So we're not talking about, two mega clubs. We're talking about two large-ish clubs, but definitely more on the disruptor side, contesting the second major European final. Does that not prove that actually you can be disruptive as long as your base is sufficient, as long as you're big enough to have a platform to build from? I think so. The other point, in terms of, look, clearly player wages are the problem. And I think this is where the Saudi League becomes a real issue. Because effectively the European leagues are so much wealthier than the rest of world football that they've sort of almost had got themselves into a place where they could start thinking about controlling wages, and the players wouldn't have an option other than to play in Europe for those wages. The problem we've got with the Saudi League is that you've now created an option where there is competition for insane wages. So you've got a player who can say, well, actually, yes, I could get paid very well in Europe, but now that they've got these cost controls, actually, I'm only getting so much, whereas the Saudi League's willing to pay me a lot more. So I'm going to be keeping a keen eye and an interest in Kieran's view on how much longer the Saudi League will carry on with that model of competing for the very, very top players. Because otherwise, if they do carry on down that route, and if, heaven forbid, there are one or two other leagues around the world who decide that's the way to go, then you'll find the top European clubs saying to the regulators, we need to be able to compete for the best players. Otherwise, you won't have the TV product to sell. And if we don't have the TV product to sell, then we won't have the revenues, and therefore the whole thing will collapse in a totally different way. So I'm just keeping a weather eye on Saudi. But if that does not really go anywhere, then top European football, by which I mean La Liga, Serie A, and the Premier League, is in a position to be more careful about what it does with wages. I am interested that the correlation at the very top level between how much is being spent and success is just slightly decorrelating at the moment. So you're seeing German clubs that have been under much more strict controls effectively because they are, various different financial reasons why they can't take in large external investment and et cetera, have actually been competing extremely well at the very top of European football. Real have been through 10 years when they have not been in a Galactico era. That's post-Galactico, but they've been much more successful now than they were in the Galactico era. You know, Madrid have been under significant financial issues in the last few years. So I think at the very, very top level, there is room for disruption, but it has to be done from a club that's big enough to be able to at least play the game, at least be able to have a great academy, be able to have enough revenue to be able to find the smart player who is going to be the next big thing, rather than necessarily always having to buy the proven stars. And often those teams at the moment are doing extremely well.
You reminded me of the case of the Chinese league, that 10 years ago it happened something similar compared to the Saudi league. Like, they were bringing all these massively known players and trainers, and then all of a sudden the bubble exploded. Is it similar, Kieran, or not?
I think it is dissimilar, and the reason for this was that the Chinese Premier and the Chinese Communist Party felt that it was inconsistent for the Chinese clubs to be shown to be having conspicuous consumption in terms of this level of wages. It was inconsistent with the philosophy of the country. Whereas I think under MBS's ambitions in Saudi Arabia, there's a young population there who are interested in sport, and the ability of the state to deliver an entertainment industry, and that's what football is. And as much as I refer to myself as a legacy fan, football's competing for the same eyeballs, for the same people who are going to see Taylor Swift and the Rolling Stones here this summer. So, and that's what we've got to be aware of. In Saudi Arabia, because of the wealth of the country, it will always be in a position to outbid players for wages, and then they've got a decision to make. And you know, we've seen in the case of some of the players, it has worked out successfully for them, and others it haven't. And that's the same when players came to the Premier League. That's when the players came to La Liga itself, historically. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. And if the Saudi Arabian authorities want to continue to spend the level of money that they do, there's no cost control rules there, so therefore they can spend as much as they want. It's a decision for them to make. But I don't see the bubble bursting in terms of ability to spend. Whether players want to play in front of 600 or 700 people for huge amounts of money once a fortnight, that's a career decision from their point of view.
Charlie, do you think that these regulations are making the game actually fairer?
Well, defining fairness is something which is famously difficult to do, and politicians fight like, you know, rats in a sack over what is the definition of fairness. You know, is it equality of opportunity, or is it equality of outcome? Famously, in political terms, the left would say equality of outcome, the right would say equality of opportunity. And it's the same in football. It's exactly the same in football, which is it fair to create an environment in which clubs are being forced to be sustainable and therefore have to think about what they're doing? Well, yeah, that's one sort of fairness, but the other sort of fairness would be to say, well, everyone deserves the chance to become top dog. So, you know, and effectively that's what Kieran was saying earlier on about sort of the reinforcement of the status quo. Is the reinforcement of the status quo fair? Well, it's fair because they are the biggest clubs and therefore should be able to pay the biggest wages. It's not fair because it means that other clubs have never got the chance to join the party. And there is a slightly ugly sense of, and obviously this became very real with the Super League, of the drawbridge being pulled up behind the clubs who happen to be in that place at that particular moment in time. And we definitely have that in England with the Premier League as well, where, you know, leave aside the big six in the Premier League, the clubs that are just below that in the Premier League have a tendency to forget that only a few years ago they were the clubs who were in the lower leagues in England, and other clubs who are in the lower leagues now were in their place in the Premier League then, and they tend to sort of just think, well, but we're here now, and we want to reinforce our position now. So fairness, I'm not sure, but the question really is a sort of sustainable ecosystem that doesn't necessarily rely on there always being another crazy guy, as Kieran said, 'cause that has been definitely football's history. 100% that's been football's history. Now, at the Premier League level, you're starting to see valuations reach a point where there isn't always a crazier guy. And we're seeing that with Everton right now, right, where total debt, 1 billion, value of club, 700 million, 800 million. It's to my mind, Kieran would probably disagree as an accountant, to my mind it's functionally insolvent as an entity, and that's basically when businesses get themselves into massive, massive problems. So they've been fishing around for an idiot for some time now who is willing to take on effectively more debt and more obligation than the asset is actually worth, and they kind of can't find one. So if you actually want a high quality of owner, i.e. somebody who has both the intelligence, the capital background, the capital underpinning to be able to sustain the business for the medium term, if they do need a new stadium, to be able to invest in that without it being financially ruinous for him or them or the consortium, whatever it might be, those types of owners are much more attracted to semi-solvent situations than they are basket cases, right? And I think that that's just something to bear in mind. If we want good owners in football, we need the football industry to be more sustainable. I'm not saying that it needs to become like the supermarket industry or the petrol station industry or anything like that. There's always going to be an element of fun and gamble and upside to it, and football club ownership brings with it other things other than just, you know, sort of a pure financial calculation. But when things get really out of control and really out of kilter, then I think that's when you start to see some pretty strange things happening. And again, going back to our former Prime Minister's comment, whole cities in floods of tears, which is what we must definitely try and avoid that.
Kieran, is there a model that we should be looking at, like ideally even outside of football maybe?
If you take a look at American franchise sports, they've got a fantastic model. But it comes at a very, very significant price. You de-risk the investment, so therefore you've got guaranteed revenues coming in. You've got the pooling of revenues. So there, if you take a look at the way that it works in the NFL, the home club keeps 60% of the gate receipts and the rest is pooled and shared out. You have a sharing of talent model through the draft system and so on. So it's absolutely fantastic, and it's very, very profitable. And that's why we see the valuations that we have in American franchise sports. The downside is that you've got no relegation. The downside is that you have no tension a lot of the time as a result. But the upside, if you look at the last 20 years, we had 14 different winners of the Super Bowl. Fantastic. Well, you can't say that in the Premier League. You can't say that in the Bundesliga. You can't say that in the SPFL. You can't really say that in La Liga and so on. So it's a fantastic model, and the Super League would have been an absolutely fantastic model for those clubs that are in the Super League because you completely de-risked the downside. Why are clubs losing money is because at present, let's take the Premier League, for example, 6 into 4 doesn't work. So therefore clubs, and from next season, winning the Champions League is going to be worth somewhere in the region of €200 million. So can you see that you've got an incentive to get into the Champions League to potentially get access to that €200 million? So how do you gain access? Well, you overspend. You overspend on players. So we have a scenario now in European football where at the top half of each division, you've got clubs who are trying to get those 2, 3, 4 Champions League places. They've got an incentive to overspend. Because of the gaps between individual divisions, you've got an incentive to overspend at the bottom of the division because you don't want to get relegated and have to deal with the financial consequences. And in your second tier of football, you've got an incentive to overspend because if you do get promoted, next season you are playing Bayern Munich and Real Madrid and PSG and Liverpool. So everybody's got an incentive to lose money, which is absolutely fantastic if you're a player because it's a talent industry and you want to get the best talent. So that's the model that we have. If you completely de-risk it, which was what's the case in Super League, from a business point of view, it's great for those 12 clubs who would have been the permanent members of the Super League.
I think actually from a business point of view, it would have been great for all the other clubs as well, because what would have happened effectively is, and just talking purely business here, the Super League would have mopped up all the global TV revenues. That would have meant that there were reformed first divisions in those countries, which included obviously the clubs who hadn't made it to Super League. Those divisions would not have been as attractive as obviously the top divisions are right now, and there would have been no sort of pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, even in winning those divisions. You do it for your own glory. I'm very happy I've won the title this year, etc., but it doesn't necessarily bring you a vast amount of money. If you're in the division below the new top division, you're looking at the top division and saying, well, I mean, they don't have huge TV revenues. It's not a huge deal, so I'm not going to overspend to try and get there. I'm sort of happy where I am. And you'd have had, from a business perspective, a much healthier ecosystem. And I have to say, there was a bit of me, only a small bit, but 20%, 25% when that Super League thing was going on. So this is just a recognition of reality, which is the very biggest clubs have already effectively detached themselves financially from the rest of the ecosystem. But their presence, their remaining presence within the ecosystem, as Kieran said, is what is lending toxicity to the entire thing. If we did let them float off and do their own thing, then the rest of the system would actually be reasonably healthy. But of course, it takes the dream away. And ultimately, football is about dreams, isn't it?
And dreams can come true.
And dreams can and do come true in football.
Absolutely. And also a question that, in our conversation, you also brought up, and I think it's very important. What do we want football to be? So that's also a sort of a, yeah, that's, of course, that's important to consider when we are thinking about rules that work or not.
So it's interesting, when I was at another, obviously far lesser conference earlier this year, the head of compliance from UEFA was there, and he was asked whether, under his new rules, what Kieran said, the reinforcement of the status quo, etc., did he regret or did he have any fears about the new rules doing that? And he said, well, what we're concerned about is the stability of professional football in Europe. It's up to other people to work out how to compete or whether to compete individual, but we're concerned with the financial stability of the ecosystem. So that's UEFA's answer, is we're concerned with the financial stability of the entire ecosystem. But if you were to ask a fan, the fan of which I'm a legacy fan, Kieran's a legacy fan, you're Brighton?
I am. So
Yeah.
I was here 6 months ago. I support a team that was in the 4th tier of English football 20 years ago. And in the last 6 months, we've beaten Ajax twice, we've beaten Roma, we've beaten Marseille. If you'd told me 20, 25 years ago that would happen, I would have escorted you to a hospital. And those dreams can come true. Is there a case for saying that the Super League, which would allow those particular clubs, which are now global brands and global institutions, to detach themselves from the rest of football, and you can still have a Champions League for all of the other clubs, could that be beneficial? I think for many clubs, it will be the greatest chances that they have, or for many fan groups, it will be the greatest chances that they'll have of getting into Europe and of winning trophies. But it would mean we would have a 2-tier system, effectively a form of apartheid in football. And is that what we want as well?
And it's just so hard to say, isn't it? Because, as you said, different people want different things from football. And, effectively, Kieran's club, Brighton, is living the ultimate dream at the moment, which is we could get into the Champions League. Who knows? Maybe we could get past the group stages in the Champions League. And then we really are in the very, very, very top table. But that's a small chance, even for Brighton right now. Whereas if the Super League did detach itself and sort of go off there, then the chances of Brighton winning the remaining European competition would become much greater. But of course, the satisfaction would be that much smaller because you haven't beaten Real and Man City and so on and so forth. So it's quite hard to say. But I think keeping the existence of dreaming alive is important for everybody. It's important to attract owners. It's important to maintain the interests of fans in what, as Kieran says, is a very competitive entertainment market. If you take that dream away, then it can a lot of football games can seem quite tedious. Quite frankly, if there isn't that dream to sort of be thinking of on that cold February night as you sort of shiver through a 0-0 draw. So you need the dream, but you need a structure which enables clubs, in my view, to gradually, as Brighton have done, gradually rise up that pyramid towards that dream, as opposed to somebody just coming in and saying, right, I'm going to take this club, and I'm just going to suddenly, through a whole injection of cash, going to make it into this, and then that person then walks away, the club goes bust, people are crying, and the whole thing's a mess. We've got to stop that. That is not right.
So you spoke about fans, and to me, that's a very important point, because they are fans right when they complain about, the owners don't understand us, they are abusing us, they are taking us for granted, and they are playing with our patience. And in the meantime, the newer generations are consuming less football, as we have done in our lives. They are just mostly watching highlights. We don't know if they are going to be season card holders in the future. They are going to maybe other sports or other, like the Kings League, for example, and other models. So is really football in danger right now, do you think?
I don't think so.
As we know it.
Yeah, as we know, I don't think so. I teach at university. I teach young people. I can assure you that their love and enthusiasm and also knowledge of the global game is incredible, because I learn that every day. I'm grading their assignments, and the diversity of thought, the ingenuity that they have, their creativity in terms of the game, I think is as it always was. Could there be alternatives which will provide for a different market for football? Yes, there are. I'm a big cricket fan, for example. The most successful form of cricket, which is now taking place, is a short form of the game. It takes place in India. It's probably now the most watched sport, certainly in the Asian subcontinent, and the money in it is fantastic. And it's also a franchise sport, so it's actually very profitable for the franchise owners. So a cut-down version of football, 20 minutes a half, could that be of interest to people? Possibly.
20 minutes ball in play, maybe. That could work. I think the fears about Gen Z are massively overblown. I've looked into it in significant detail, and the difference in interest in football consumption between Gen Z and millennial is very small, very, very small. It's a little bit lower, but it's very, very small. And by football, I mean actually watching the game. I don't mean the actual having an interest in football. Gen Z are higher than the millennials. So I'm just talking about wanting to actually watch 90 minutes of a match is very marginally lower for Gen Z than is millennials. But you also got to remember that millennials are still young people. They're going to be with us for 40 to 50 years. So I think that football's in any imminent trouble? No. I am interested in some of the mapping coming out of the Premier League. The Premier League does have a problem, right, which is that they're operating at 99.4% stadium capacity, and the average age of their season ticket holders is 44, right? And they can't add any season ticket holders, because they're at the maximum 4 season tickets, and you don't want to keep on giving away more and more discounted tickets. There are massive waiting lists for season tickets, and if you are going to purchase match-by-match tickets in the Premier League, you're talking about 50, 60, 70, 80 pounds. So you're talking about, for anyone under the age of 30, difficult to get a season ticket, if not impossible. If you purchase match-by-match, ruinously expensive for somebody of that age, given their net income. So that's a challenge, and it's one which, as a non-Premier League London club with a very large stadium, is something that we're pursuing very, very, very actively and aggressively right now, is that market. So I think the Premier League's got an interesting issue there. They've also got a problem with the diversity of their crowds as well, because, again, you can't really change that when your stadium's already full. It's very hard to change that. So there are some challenges within the whole thing, but that's all healthy. What's a challenge for one type of club is an opportunity for another kind of club. But do I think that there's actually a generational problem? Definitely not. Absolutely not. There's really no supporting data that suggests that.
Now, the name of this panel, and by the way, we are just in the last 5 minutes. Now, this panel has been very, very interesting, and I knew that the conversation would just flow like this. Maybe the last question for the two of you. Do you think that the Manchester City case is the big opportunity to prove that the sustainability rules actually work, instead of just getting away with it by having a lot of money and the best lawyers?
As somebody that spent 40 years living in the city of Manchester, it has somewhat split the city, I've got to be honest. When I talk, and more importantly, when I listen to sports lawyers, we have 3 effective charges against Manchester City. First of all, that they have disguised money from the owners as revenue. If that is the case, then that effectively has to be a coordinated fraud between the football club, between the sponsors, and you would also have to ask yourself, what have the auditors been doing? They've either been asleep at the wheel, or they've been incompetent, or they've been part of this. I don't think that they've been part of this. No firm of accountants would go down that particular route. So I think it's a very, very high threshold. Secondly, there's been the accusation that Manchester City have not cooperated with the investigations into their affairs. If somebody had hacked your email, and on the basis of that you were being charged, would you cooperate? My answer would be no. So I think Manchester City probably got a fair case for non-cooperation. I think that the issue where I think the club is at its weakest point is with regards to the use of parallel contracts. So what I mean by that, for example, Roberto Mancini was accused of having a contract of employment at Manchester City for €2 million a year. And in addition, he was doing 4 days coaching in Abu Dhabi for €2 million a year. Which, if somebody wants to pay me for 4 lectures in Abu Dhabi for €2 million this year, I will quite happily give up 4 days of my holiday from the university. So I think that's where the auditors wouldn't get involved, because it's a private arrangement between an individual and another person. Are there related party involvements there? There is the opportunity for that. So the Manchester City case will be an intriguing one. If Manchester City are found guilty of the charges, then that's the equivalent of corporate fraud. And I cannot see how the board of directors can survive. I think we'd have to go to a position that we've previously seen at clubs such as Juve, Rangers in Scotland, where this will be deemed to be a major misdemeanor, and the club really should be exiting the Premier League as a due punishment. But listening to Manchester City's lawyers, their attitude is bring it on. They are very, very confident of defending their case.
I think in answer to your original question, is it proof that profit and sustainability rules work? No, it's evidence that profit and sustainability rules don't work. It's a case that's dragged on for forever and a day while Man City have continued to win titles, and has caused a great deal of confusion and general sort of uncertainty about the integrity of the sporting competition. So no, I think it's been an absolute disaster. Yeah, I sort of share Kieran's estimation of the 3 main areas of charges. I think the first one is, Kieran said earlier on, whenever you get a new set of rules, the accountants get busy. They say, this is what you could do, this is what you could get away with. And I think, if nothing else, what's happening to City right now, because I think it's highly implausible that they're going to get away with all of it, if I'm being honest with you, it should serve as a warning sign to clubs listening too much to their accountants on these things. You need to be saying to the accountants, tell me what's definitely going to be okay. Don't tell me what I might get away with, because down the track, I'm the one who's going to take the rap, and you'll say, well, and if you look at my advice, it was an either or, it was yes or could be, should be, might, could be, et cetera, et cetera. So that first area of overstating sponsorship revenues is a grey area. It's an area which I think, if it was that alone, I don't think it would be or should be punishable in the sort of dramatic way we're talking about. I don't think it's a fraud. I think it's trying it on a bit, and I think it would be seen as such. The other 2 areas are obviously much closer to what might generally be called fraud, and how they view the non-cooperation will be interesting. The third bit, as Kieran said, is if that is as is alleged to be the case, then they are going to be absolutely banged to rights. That's clearly cheating. So it's going to be very interesting to see. But I think it is, as I said, it's serving as a warning shot to all of us in the industry. Doesn't matter how big you are. If you think that you can try and jump through little sort of loopholes here and loopholes there, you could end up becoming an almighty cropper, and it could be a real, real problem, not just for the club, but for you directors personally.
Thank you so much. We are it's 11 seconds, 10, 9, and it's perfect timing. Thank you so much, Charlie Methven and Kieran Maguire. Please give it up for them.